They call me the devil's disciple.
George Bernard Shaw's melodrama of the American War of Independence begins a brand new season of Theatre Night on BBC Two.
From this day, this house is his home, and no child shall cry in it. And this hearth is his altar, and no soul shall ever cower over it in the dark evenings and be afraid. Now then, which of you good men will take this child and rescue her from the house of the devil?
I think, sir, it will probably relieve both our feelings if we proceed to hang this dissenter without further delay. Especially as I am debarred by my principles from the customary military bent for my feelings. Bring your man in. Yes, sir. And mention to any officer you may meet that the court cannot wait any longer for him.
A new season of Theatre Night begins with The Devil's Disciple on Sunday at 7:45 on 2. Sports Night on BBC One now features football with the European Cup Winners' Cup final in Athens and also a preview of Saturday's FA Cup final at Wembley. And in the world of athletics, multi-gold medalist Carl Lewis talks about his plans for the World Championships in Rome. On 2 now, Duncan Campbell looks inside Britain's radar defences in secret society.
NATO AWACS early warning aircraft returning to base in Lincolnshire. It's been out over the North Sea, doing a job we can't do for ourselves. Since 1984, Britain's been quietly borrowing AWACS from our NATO allies because of our costly failure to produce our own airborne radar aircraft. That's not a secret, just something the Ministry of Defence would prefer wasn't discussed openly. This, of course, is the reason for the Ministry's embarrassment. Britain's Nimrod should have been in service 3 years ago. But at the end of last year, with almost £1 billion already spent on it, the Nimrod project was abandoned. Nimrod's been a very public disaster for Britain's defence industry, but it's actually just the latest in a long line of similar radar disasters. Successive governments have hidden the fact that every major new radar system since 1945 has been a failure. 3 separate £1 billion projects have gone wrong, in complete secrecy. And there's another critical radar system that electronically sorts out our aircraft from theirs. That's been useless for 25 years. Meanwhile, key roles are still played by elderly equipment. The Shackleton early warning aircraft, designed in the early 1940s. This Type 80 radar, designed 35 years ago. And Bloodhound surface-to-air missiles, 30 years old.
The Shackletons clearly were due to be phased out a few years back, but of course until we've got our own AEW capability, we shall hang on to them. The Bloodhound, of course, is one of those systems that can go on for a very long time. I suppose you're talking about an 18th century knife that's had 4 new blades and 3 new handles.
I think it's perfectly fair to say that one would never have a perfect air defence system. But what you don't really want is to have an air defence system which is like a piece of Emmentaler cheese, in which the holes are more important than the cheese, as it were.
I think we've always had a rather romantic view of our radar capability as being the inventors of it. And of course, the whole science of radar has moved enormously fast, and every time somebody's invented something, somebody else has invented something better.
Britain pioneered radar in the early years of the last war. To watch out for enemy raids, strange masts were positioned around the south and east coasts. The chain home system gave early warning of German bombers crossing to Britain. Clumps of the huge masts still survive today, put to different uses now, but still dominating the coastline at some familiar and appropriate spots, like the White Cliffs of Dover. In 1949, just 4 years after the war, the Soviet Union became the third country to develop the A-bomb. In Britain, there was a sudden hectic panic to rearm and to reconstruct radar defense stations, protecting them from atomic attack.
It was realized they were very, very vulnerable to nuclear attack, and therefore the decision was made to put them all underground, dig big holes and shove them all underground. And that was basically part of the Rota plan.
The Rotor plan took 5 years to complete. Money was just poured into Britain's underground electronic Maginot Line. Entrances to the subterranean radar stations were painstakingly disguised as farm bungalows, standing sentinel over tunnels deep into the earth. Nearly 80 new stations and 1,600 monitoring screens went below ground. The biggest bunkers of all accommodated the regional sector operations centres. Barnton Quarry is discreetly tucked into wooded suburbs near Edinburgh. It was once the sector operations centre for Scotland. Barnton Quarry is a Type R4 three-storey underground bunker, one of 4 major centres like it in the Rota network. Constructing just one centre like this was likened in Parliament to the amount of work involved in building a major new London Underground railway station. But Barnton Quarry and its counterparts was to be of service to the Royal Air Force for scarcely 3 years. Far from the surface, these vast underground vaults came into operation during 1953. More than 50 rooms accommodated controllers, their plots, the communication centre. Huge plant rooms circulated air to remove radioactive fallout. But filter rooms like this were the Achilles heel of the Rotor system. Information coming in was endlessly passed round and got to ground controllers far too late.
You often got cases where the chief controller at the GCI will be given a position for a raid, and he'd look on his radar tube and there wasn't a thing in the sky at that position.
I think basically what went wrong with Rotor, which was 2 things. I mean, it took a lot longer to get into operation, and of course it was much more costly than was forecast. That was common of most systems in those days, and isn't unknown even in these days.
Even before Rotor began, it was doomed. British intelligence had forecast the arrival of jet fighters. Soviet MiG-15s were soon in action in Korea. Old-fashioned radar was dead on its feet. Fast jet fighters could be on their way home by the time defending fighters were scrambled. But the first version of a dramatically new type of radar scanner was delivered in 1955. The new scanners had a long range and a clear and precise picture.
Some of the sharper brains at the lower levels of the service, I hasten to add, realised that this was the answer. That here you had your early warning, you had your control capacity off the same tube, therefore, what was to stop you taking over the whole function of noting the presence of incoming hostile attackers, scrambling aircraft from a particular airfield, and taking them over yourself, all on the same, from the same radar picture, without any intermediaries, any filtering, any SOC, or anything at all. And that was the key to it. It all happened at one particular place, Bulmer, on the northeast coast of Northumberland.
One controller at RAF Bulmer got permission to try and do the whole radar control job himself. The results were dramatic. Top-secret RAF plans from 1955 show what happened next. The experiment succeeded. Other centres just weren't needed. So the Rotor plan came to a quick, costly and completely secret end. There had been about 75 stations in the original Rotor network. Nearly 30 had closed by the start of 1958. By July that year, 16 more stations had closed. By December, only 15 stations remained, and the closures continued. By 1964, there were just 5 master radar stations left, with 2 sentries at the extremities of Britain. So most rotor stations now stand desolate and derelict. Probing Russians could hardly fail to notice that 70 of 75 British radar stations had rapidly gone off the air, but the British public was left in its usual happy state of complete ignorance. The public was to hear nothing of rotor until 1961, and nothing thereafter. This officially inspired report described the rotor network as
ultra-sophisticated.
But the rotor system had been taken apart 3 years before. There was now a new military factor, British nuclear weapons carried by V-bombers. And the view of the Battle of Britain would now be obsolete too. There'd be no point in defending Britain from the air, because enough enemy missiles and aircraft could always get through. So all that nuclear deterrent plans needed from radar was a tripwire to say that an attack was coming. Then the nuclear retaliation force would be unleashed for the counter-attack on their cities, and that would be the end of everything.
It was, of course, the strategy of massive retaliation. It was designed to be able to give us sufficient warning to get our V-bombers off in time to make such a strike, and that was all. Our fighter assets were very small, and it wasn't meant to be an air defense system that could sustain and operate over a long period against conventional attack.
The nuclear tripwire meant that the next radar network required only 3 radar stations. They'd feed all their information to a single national control center. This plan was codenamed Linesman. But no operators would work at the 3 remaining air defense stations. A network of post office relay towers would pipe their radar pictures to the national control center instead. The plan was that they'd then be analyzed entirely by computers. West Drayton was the Linesman control center. All the RAF's remaining radar operators were to work here, in an ugly checkered brown building codenamed L1, Linesman 1. But Linesman 1 had some remarkable vulnerabilities. All the data from the East Coast radar stations was gathered together at the Post Office Tower in London and fed through underground telephone cables to West Drayton. The cables came down this West London street, but there was one major security flaw. The cables came underneath this post office manhole cover in Bayswater, where, as was later to be drawn to the attention of the Royal Air Force, they were positioned almost directly underneath the embassy of the Soviet Union, vulnerable either to a telephone tapping tunnel or a swift act of sabotage in time of crisis or war. There was, however, just one saving grace to this aspect of the linesman system, for which the cable was critical. The system never worked, so there wasn't much to listen to. The new radar system would depend entirely on computers. Part of the Plessy Company, which specialized in building telephone exchanges, was asked to design a new range of computers. These, the XL computers, were to be at the heart of the Linesman 1 control center. Secret Society has obtained computer specifications which enable us to describe for the first time what these linesman computers were actually supposed to do. The documents reveal that the computers were built before anyone had any idea of how to write programs for them, a bit like building a car before you realized it might need wheels as well as an engine. Guy Cooney, an expert computer analyst, has studied the secret specification for the XL computers.
I've no evidence that it ever actually was built as such. It looks to me as if it was very, very slow. I mean, incredibly slow. It had about enough memory that it could perhaps have run a reasonably successful traffic management scheme for a local borough, perhaps something like that.
For 4 years, Mel Wallace was a member of the Plessy programming team that tried to get linesman going.
I didn't find the system to operate. It never did operate.
So even the reliability could never be tested on linesman?
It was never proven to my knowledge.
If you'd built the system, which parts of it never were built, you would have been very lucky, I think, to have it going for maybe 10 minutes a week.
It's like a glorified telephone exchange. There were 21 computers in the main computer house, attached to rows and rows of storage cabinets.
The linesman computer plans explain that many of the XL computers were unable to talk directly to each other. This they called a hardware mismatch, and if programmers didn't deal with it in the right way, the result was, in their words, complete chaos.
I seriously doubt that these computers could ever have worked seriously together as long as there was any sense of urgency involved.
There were a couple of instances where specialists were brought in to try and beef up the teams that were on site. There were personnel from the ballistic missile early warning system, which was at Fylingdales, that were brought down here to work on the system.
What was the reaction of the people from these other radar centres when they came to West Drayton and saw what was going on?
I think generally it was despair.
It's hard to believe they had any serious concept of what they were trying to do when you look at the specification. The whole thing actually sounds to me very like an early Space Invaders type game. The complexity of what this is doing is comparable with what linesmen could have done, but linesmen had to do a very much more complex task.
With a less capable computer?
With a very much less capable computer, yes.
Even if the computers and radar screens worked, there was another serious problem. The National Control Centre, computers, operators and all, were situated above ground. Just one conventional bomb could have destroyed the whole lot.
If you put all your eggs in one basket, if somebody drops a brick on that basket, you've lost all your eggs and probably your basket as well. In other words, if you knock out the nerve centre, the body dies.
But the linesman fiasco was a complete secret. Neither Parliament nor public learned how badly things were going wrong.
I was concerned about the situation. It's a very expensive system, and I went to Westminster and had a word with my MP about it.
But there was no investigation. Through selective leaks to the press, what the public found out was, to say the very least, misleading. For example, this officially inspired 1969 report.
Linesman will be a refreshing change from the parade of costly flops. For once, a really successful project. The Ministry is satisfied that linesman will do the job it was designed for, and more.
Complete rubbish, and they knew it. This old government information film includes a unique glimpse of the XL computers themselves. But they're not working. The government was told that the project was so obsolete it could not cope with any air threat.
It's quite clear that when people were moving into the modern computer age, they were expecting perhaps rather more than they were able to actually achieve. Computers were in vast buildings, in vast cabinets, valve technology, and not always as speedy and as capable as we'd all hoped.
Hearing this, a parliamentary select committee asked for a full report. They never got it. By 1975, all hope of using West Drayton as a control centre was abandoned, and the computers, which had never ever worked, went on the scrap heap. Only the re-equipped linesman radar stations on the East Coast survived. The result is that in 1986, stations like Bulmer are doing the job using the same system that they invented here in 1956. The plotting tables have long since gone and been replaced by computers, but the basic methods remain unaltered. Radar trackers try to identify any new blips that appear on their screens. They mark it as a target for others to follow. Once the radar's locked onto a trace, information goes into a computer display called RAP, the Recognised Air Picture. RAP can then show what's coming and going in the skies around Britain and beyond. With information from other NATO stations, RAP operators can look at aircraft movements over Scandinavia and even parts of the Soviet Union. The Buckinghamshire countryside's at the heart of a new billion-pound series of projects. A new UK radar system is to replace what's left from linesmen. An RAF Air Operations Centre has been built 4 stories deep on National Trust land next door. They're calling it improvements, but it's actually a total reconstruction of the radar network.
The improved United Kingdom Air Defence Ground Environment, or IUCAT, which is our shorthand acronym, really sums up all those things which form part of our air defence structure that doesn't fly.
UCAT is a very, very complex system, the United Kingdom Air Defence Ground Environment. a system probably more complex than has been devised anywhere else.
It is, of course, a very ambitious programme. It's only just beginning to come into service. We will start moving into the proper architecture next year, and we'll have to wait and see just exactly what we get.
Is it running on time?
It has slipped a little bit, but now we're confident that it's coming in on time.
The new UCAD system isn't on the scale of Rotor, nor as centralised as Linesman, but it does involve 11 large underground controls. The UCAD system was due to be operational last year. Now it'll be phased in from now until the 1990s, and that's a problem. Sitting on top of a hill at Bulmer, this frontline operations centre is like a crab out of its shell, while it grows a new one. For more than 5 years, Bulmer and other similar control centres have been housed in prefabricated buildings, protected from attack by a few inches of wood. They're very vulnerable. But until the old Rotor Underground bunker is open again, as a working part of UCAD, there's nowhere else for them to go.
Like everything else, when one's in a state of transition, it's always very difficult. But no, I don't have any great concern in that respect. I believe that the architecture, the command and control structure that we have today could cope with that situation. But of course, I'll be a lot happier when it is all underground, and that is, of course, well before the end of the decade.
The time when Bulmer's fighter controllers can come back down the hill and go in underground again has been held up by computer software problems. First, the contracting companies argued about which computer they would choose, and then about which programming language. Finally, they found that some of the computers they'd received were incompatible with each other.
Again, you're highlighting, quite rightly, some of what I might call the inevitable problems that occur when you really are ambitious and try, in fact, to solve some very, very complex problems in an integrated way.
But one of the most important parts of the system will be missing for some time to come. Nimrod failed because its computers didn't work properly. At first, the plane flew perfectly and everything worked, until the radar was turned on. What went wrong was that soon after that, the computer got very, very confused as the number of targets increased. The most spectacular problem occurred when the radar looked down on Britain itself. Suddenly, the screen's swarming with activity. Hundreds of low, slow, unidentified targets are all over Britain. They're at 0 feet, speed 60 to 90 miles an hour. To sort out articulated lorries from enemy helicopters and missiles, the contractors had to install yet another computer inside the already tightly packed Nimrod. After this had been done, late last year, Defense Secretary George Younger ordered the final deciding playoff between Nimrod and the American AWACS. Nimrod lost. All this time, the ministry had been keeping quiet about the fact that Britain was getting regular use of NATO's AWACS. Britain had, after all, originally rejected AWACS in going for Nimrod. But the RAF isn't so shy about demonstrating the quality of what AWACS provides. This is the NATO early warning aircraft link position at Bulmer. Marked by a white cross, the AWACS is 200 miles away and 6 miles up over the North Sea. Its information relayed down clearly and precisely. So it's easy to see why the RAF wanted AWACS. Even when UCAD and the British Early Warning Aircraft Force are in operation, the government's got to face another billion-pound radar problem. This secondary radar scanner operates the identification of friend or foe, or IFF system. Like an old medieval watchkeeper, the IFF radar scanner electronically hails each passing aircraft, asking them if they be friend or foe. When a friendly aircraft is detected, a special IFF signal should be sent back automatically.
8 at the moment, 2 can stay.
Then a friendly identification code appears. But the IFF system is old, it's unreliable, and the Russians know exactly how it works. Not because of a spy in the Royal Air Force, but because Britain officially sold them the whole system in the 1960s. Nowadays, Aeroflot airliners carry IFF systems based on the RAF design. The first IFF system was actually devised during the Second World War. It hasn't improved a lot since.
I think if I remember rightly, there was a little button down the left-hand side of the cockpit which had sort of white painted lines on saying IFF, and which we were supposed to press on, you know, in the hope that sort of friendly ships or army wouldn't shoot at you, which was not always realised.
Did it work?
Not really, I think, very well, but I suppose it gave you at least some psychological comfort.
No. I don't think at the moment that there is any question but the fact that IFF, if I use the word shambles, that would be too strong a word, but certainly our arrangements for IFF at the moment are far from valid.
If there were to be a reason to get worried about it, we could start shooting down our own side's aircraft very quickly indeed because of these problems.
In, as they say, the heat of the battle, that would certainly be a real possibility.
Open records of the fact that in NATO exercises, so we tend to shoot down quite a large number of our own aircraft. Not shoot them down literally, but they're recorded as losses.
Incidentally, we're not the only ones with an identification problem. They also have one too. And of course, if they have many more aircraft than we do, then they have many more chances of shooting down their own airplanes than we do ours.
The basic problems with IFF are: what do you do if an incoming aircraft is not shown as friendly? Do you launch a missile? It might actually be a friendly aircraft whose IFF isn't working. Or if it's shown as friendly, might it really be an enemy spoofing by sending your side signals? There's only seconds to decide. The whole of southern England would become a deadly missile engagement zone. Any aircraft entering the area may do so facing the risk of their own death and destruction.
I mean, this is probably the most long-running technological operational saga of them all. Again, I think you are up against a phenomenally difficult problem.
As I understand the situation, we might easily now, we have an agreement on, in principle, it's a compromise agreement, as you might expect. There's nothing wrong with that within the alliance. As I understand it, that could be implemented now within 3 years.
But at the minute, it just doesn't work.
But at the moment, it certainly doesn't work.
The House of Commons have been told that a new NATO identification system will cost Britain at least hundreds of millions of pounds. That's after NATO manages to agree on a common standard. But meanwhile, confidence in the future of UCAG is still high.
I believe that this architecture that we've laid down, which is flexible enough to cope with new systems being buttoned on and old ones being taken out in the future, with the new fighters we're getting, with the new tankers and airborne early warning and everything else, that we are going to have a very efficable air defense system in this country for the next 20 or more years.
The Warsaw Pact systems, Soviet systems, are somewhat decried for their crudity and their lack of workmanship and quite a number of things. But at least there are two important features about them. One, they're there, and two, they work.
Does secrecy help or hinder the effectiveness of these projects?
Secrecy is designed, I suppose, to make sure that they are what they are, secret, and will therefore come as some stunning surprise to a potential enemy. But if secrecy works against objective judgment, if it's used and employed, again, politically to cover up colossal blunders, then of course it's its own worst enemy.
4 major billion-pound radar defense projects that didn't work. Rotor, Linesman, Nimrod, and IFF. Every time, the public and Parliament were the last people to find out that things had gone so badly wrong. And now another billion-pound radar system's under construction here. UCAG. Those who are in the know say that this time things are working out fine. But even if they're right, the effectiveness of UCAG is undermined by the failure of Nimrod to provide airborne early warning, and by an IFF system, which, it seems, might as well not be there. And one thing we can be sure of: were there to be one more costly disaster, we'd be the very last people to hear about it.
Tomorrow, the story of two babies and their struggle for survival continues in Edge of Life.
For babies with enlarging heads, needle tapping